One love to the humble, one love to the humble, one love to the humble. Grace and peace be multiplied unto you. Hey, look, I'm thankful for everything that's been going on this year. Now, if you're watching this video tonight on New Year's Eve, or you may be watching this video in the new year, whichever one it is, I really appreciate you being here. And for those who have been here a long period of time, I really appreciate you also, because without you, it wouldn't be no me. And the reason why I'm doing this is only because of you. That's why I'm able to continue to do this. And I thank you for that. I really, really appreciate it. I can't explain it. You know what I'm saying? I really, really appreciate it. This ain't about me. I don't do it for me. You see, I don't ask for subscribers. I don't ask for likes. I don't do all of that stuff. I just put the video content out and I just leave. I'm not doing it for nothing more than just information so we can do better. And you can take this video and do it with it as you please. You can share it. You can not watch it. You can do whatever you want. But I'm not asking for nothing. All I want you to do is just get this information and do something with it. If you don't like it, I understand. But if it's something that you like and something you understand and something you think others will benefit from, share it with them. Share it with them. And I appreciate it. I mean, it was a long, hard battle to even get over 1,000 subscribers because of the type of content that I do. It's okay though. So everything ain't gonna be easy. Sometimes you just gotta grind it out. And that's what I'm willing to do. If I can only reach one, then I did my job. But look, enough of me talking. Let me get right into what I want to talk about. I got some notes here, as I usually do. Here are some notes. And this is about gang violence, right? It's about how gang violence had destroyed the black community. What I'm going to do, I'm going to give you some pointers, some notes I took. Now, this is one of them things that I could have went on for days. I could have went on for hours. But I'm not going to go on for days and hours because I know a lot of our attention spans are not that long. So to go on that long would not be good for anyone. Hopefully you watch this to the end. But if you don't watch it to the end, I understand, because most people only watch about 10 minutes and then they tune out. But anyway, look, we're talking about gangs in the black community. And the most prevalent gangs in the black community are the Bloods and the Crips. Now, there are other gangs out there, but the ones that we mostly know of, that's most notable, are the Bloods and Crips. And the Crip gang started in 1969 under the leadership of Raymond Washington, right? That's who started the Crip gang. Now, I know you heard also another person called Tookie Williams, and Tookie Williams was he got lethal injection. I should have wrote the year down, but he got lethal injection. He was locked up in prison. He got lethal injection for a crime he committed back in the day. And then in the 1970s, the Brims and the Pyrus formed an alliance calling themselves the Bloods. Now, this is what the research I've come up with. Now, if you've been a part of these organizations, these gangs for a long time, and my information is wrong, then correct me, but I'm just going off of what my research has shown me. I don't just speak from my head. I don't make stuff up. I do research. If it's something that I don't know about. If I lived it, I'm going to tell you what I know. But some things I got to research. So like I said, the Crip gang started in 1969 under the leadership of Raymond Washington. And then in the 1970s, the Brims and the Pyrus formed an alliance calling themselves the Bloods. So that's how this began. Now, if my research serves me correctly, and all the things I've watched, and all the things I've looked up, it was showing me that it was started because they was protecting the neighborhood back in those days, right? They was protecting the neighborhood from, I guess, the police and other people were coming in, doing things to the neighborhood, and they wanted to protect it, so they formed these gangs. I believe that's how it started. If I'm wrong, correct me, as I said. Now, these things were a branch off of what was going on during the civil rights time. Because see, remember, 1965, in the 60s itself, all the way up into the 70s, we had like in the black community, we had like a big movement that was starting. A lot of black people were forming organizations and gangs and things like that. And this is one of them. See, like the Black Panthers came out of the civil rights movement. A lot of other things came out of the civil rights movement. But this was going on in the 60s. Black people were uniting finally and coming together. But it was based off of what was going on with the civil rights movement. Do I personally think any of that was necessary? No. I don't think civil rights was necessary at all. That's my firm belief, and I stand on that, and I'm not going to change that. So remember, April 4th, 1968 is when Martin Luther King was assassinated. The Crip gang started in 1969, a year later. February 24th, 1965, which was before, I should have said it the other way around. February 24th, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated in 65. That was right in the middle of the civil rights movement when it was really peaking. And then 3 years later, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I'm sorry, 4 years later, 4 years later, Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And then in 1969, according to my research, the Crip gang was started. And then during the 70s, they don't give a specific date, the Brims and the Pyrus formed the Bloods. That's why if you always hear people saying, you might hear somebody say a Pyru, but it's like a sub part of the Bloods. It's all the same thing, right? Now, when we talk about gang violence, it was devastating to the black community. When you really look at what was going on and what was happening, it was devastating. But see, it started out there in California, and it was like centralized to California. The black gangs, the Bloods and the Crip, it was centralized to California. So a lot of people outside of that didn't really know about the gangs in the early 70s because it was still brand new. Now, for some of you who watching this video, you may be younger. You may not be born in the 70s. You may have been born in the late 90s. You may have been born in the 2000s. But I'm here to tell you, people that was born in the 70s are still here today. People that was born in the 60s are still here today. They remember these times. There was a time before gangs. There was a time before any of this took place. There was a time when life was very different for black people than it is today. And it's hard to make you understand that because you don't know the difference. All you know is what you was born into. There was a time before my time when it was better than my time. I was born in the 70s. There were people born in the 40s and 50s that was very, very different than what we experience today. There was no gangs. Black people were not participating in gangs like that back then. It just wasn't happening. But, of course, with the civil rights movement, all that created a new environment for these things to be birthed. Now, when you get up into the 80s, right, if you really look at it, what was happening was the gangs were active. They was doing what the gangs do. They was protecting the neighborhoods. But somewhere in there, it shifted, where they became not just protecting the neighborhood, but they started becoming violent, right? Because even during that times, black people, some black people were in poverty. And those are the main places that the gangs were starting in. They didn't have really too much going on, so it was just natural. Excuse me. It was just natural for that to happen in that area. Now, I don't know if Raymond Washington did this on purpose or he was coerced. Government be involved in a lot of things. I don't know. I really don't know. And I don't think there's anywhere you can really look at this and find out. But that's what happens, right? Now, what makes it go statewide or travel nationally was the music. Anytime you want something to move, you put it in the music. If you want to know what's going on with a culture, you listen to the music. The music will tell you what's going on in the culture because arts is a part of culture, in case you didn't know. So the 80s was when it started to when it started to increase in membership and activity as well as violence in the 80s. Now, also what was going on in the 80s, that's when the crack era hit. Now, we ain't had nothing like that since. For those of you who are alive today who wasn't really born in the 80s or was child in the 80s, who really didn't see what was going on in the 80s and 90s, maybe you was born in the late 90s and you just don't know. There ain't nothing like that happened since then. What was going on in the black community in the 80s was terrible. That crack epidemic was terrible. Some people say they're 80s, right? But the crack epidemic went from the 80s all the way to the late 90s, like 97, 98, 99. It wasn't just the 80s. It went on for a long period of time. I know. I lived it. It wasn't just the 80s. It was the 80s and the 90s. It was probably the early 80s, mid 80s, late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, and it started tapering off in the late 90s, like close to 2000. But it was still going strong during that time. I mean, real strong. And the violence was increasing because the money was doing good, and the gangs got involved in the drugs. They got involved in all that kind of activity. So violence was through the roof during that time because there was a lot of money being made. A lot of money to be made back then. You might not believe it. Just do a little research on some of the prominent kingpins during that time and look at the money they was making. And you could hear people saying it, but you won't believe it. You would think it's not true. But it's true. You should have seen it. There ain't nothing, it ain't been nothing like that since. And it can't be, it won't ever be again because during that time, it was very different. Like the way we got video cameras everywhere, people got doorbell cams, cameras on the streets, cameras. I mean, ain't no way you can go now where there's not a camera videotaping you, video recording you. People got phones. There's always somebody recording something all the time. And it may not be intentional, but everything is always getting recorded. You can't do today what you could do back then. It just won't happen. And even though you can't do today what you did back then, even back then, they were still moving in silence. Even back then, when there wasn't no way to really track stuff, they still was moving in silence. So it was almost impossible to catch them unless they was just dropping bodies. If they wasn't dropping bodies, they could slide right under the radar, and it was ridiculous. But back to the gangs. So the gangs were growing. And like everything else, right, but it got intertwined into rap music. That was the birth of gangster rap. That's how gangster rap got birthed. Because of the gang culture out there in Cali went into the music, and then the music they was promoting started spreading because everybody was fascinated by the gang culture once they found out what it was. See, when it created itself in the late 60s, early 70s, it wasn't widespread, so most people didn't even know that it existed. But once they knew about it and they saw it, it started becoming fascinating. Like nowadays, you see people crip walking on TV, and it's like a fad. I mean, not a fad, but it's like a trend to do it. Back then, you wasn't like that. If you wasn't no crip, you been out being crip walking. It just wasn't gonna happen. But nowadays, it's looked at as a dance. But back then, it wasn't looked at like that. If you was out there crip walking and you wasn't no crip, it was gonna be bad. But times have changed. People got nicer and easier to get along with, and so now it's like a dance because it got intertwined with the music, and they couldn't control it no more. They couldn't keep it down. Everybody was doing it because they seen the people like Dub C was one of the pioneers who brought it to the rap. Who brought it to the scene, the crip walk, and all of that. You saw them doing that, and everybody thought it was a cool dance. Well, it wasn't a dance. It was just their culture, what they did in the Crips. But people saw it as something fascinating, and they liked the way it looked, and they wanted to do it, and it looked good with the music, so everybody started doing it. So then it spread like that. So Crip was like a real popular thing in the 90s. Bloods wasn't really a popular thing. Not as much as the Crips were. But it got intertwined into the music, and then it became gangster rap. That's what they labeled it as, gangster rap. People were doing it in the 80s, but the 90s is really when the gangster rap exploded. I mean, it went to another level in the 90s because the music was taking off. That's when you had Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, them first came out with G Thing, you know, all that started hitting the scene, and they really, really took it to another level. Exhibit, all the West Coast rappers, that's what they was doing. They brought it to the scene. So now everybody, this worldwide. I mean, well, it did go worldwide, but at the time, it was nationwide. Everybody was like, wow, what is this right here? Because we hadn't heard nothing like that before. You know, nowadays, you know, it's not even a thing no more. There ain't nothing new that, it's nothing new exciting happening anymore. But back then, it was it was like, whoa, what's this? You can't understand it unless you was there to understand how it felt to hear something like that and to see that, because you never saw it before. Maybe people from Cali already understood it, but the rest of the United States had never seen that like that. It was a phenomenon. And I don't think we're gonna ever have any more phenomenons unless people get back to being creative again. But right now, these days, nobody's creative. Everybody's just doing what everybody else is doing. But back to the gang violence. So it introduced crime. Crime started making its way into music, and the way they started putting it in the songs and making it seem okay to do crime. That wasn't a black thing. Out here wilding out like we do today with all the crime, all the shooting, all the violence. We wasn't doing that like that back then. It just wasn't like that. It wasn't a free for all. Yeah, people was getting dealt with, but that was only centralized to certain locations. It wasn't just everybody just partaking in things that they're not a part of. That was known. Gangs were known to do it, but it wasn't just everybody wasn't doing it. It wasn't the same thing, right? So when it got into the rap music, the crime levels went up. The carjacking, they was doing carjackings, armed robbery, narcotics trafficking. All of that was a result of gangs. Gangs brought all of that stuff to worldwide because then it became in movies. They was putting it in movies like Menace to Society. Things like that was fascinating to the people who wasn't doing that. You know what I'm saying? If you wasn't involved in that lifestyle, that was very fascinating to watch in a movie, right? It was very, very fascinating. And it just kept people moving in a way that they probably wouldn't have never been moving before. Now, I'm bouncing around, but I want to go back. So when we talk about the violence is going to lead to incarceration. The carjacking, the crime, the violence, the robberies, all that stuff will lead to incarceration. But that was what the gangs were participating in, because a lot of the gangs were being formed in impoverished neighborhoods. So of course, if you in that neighborhood, you join that gang because you see they got money, you see they involved in a lot of things. And you back in the 80s, when the gangs were just starting to get a real strong rise, you know, crack hit. And so all that just like balled up into one big issue. It just created a branch off of so many different issues, right? So if you go back to 1960, 8,328 black people were incarcerated. And we were 10.5% of the population then. Now, like I told you, 1969, the Crips started. Sometime in the 70s, the Bloods were started. Now, the crack hit in 1980. In 1980, black people were 11.5% of the population. 143,000 black men were incarcerated. Right? Think about that. We went from 8,000 in 1960 to 143,000 in 1980. In 20 years, look at that jump. But we went from 10.5% of the population to 11.5% of the population. So we went up, what, 1%? We went up 1% of the population, but look how much we went up in incarceration. From 8,000 to 143,000. Think about how that's what's going on here. And that was prior to the gangs. Prior to the gangs was 1960. 1980, gangs in full effect. And now we had 143,000 incarcerated. But see, we blame that on white supremacy and stuff like that. That ain't got nothing to do. That's not what this is, man. It's not. And see, also, prior to the civil rights movement, we had two-parent households. We had morals. We had values. We had things that was holding us together. I'm not here to tell anybody they got to be involved in church. I'm not telling you to be following God. I can't tell you that. I could tell you that, but you got to do that for you. You got to want it. But I'm telling you, back then, that's what they had. They had the church. Not preachers like today doing crazy stuff. They had real preachers, real church, real things going on, real solid values, real things holding the community together. That's what they had. They had two parents in the house, not baby mamas and baby daddies. That's a new phenomenon that came about later on, like in the late 80s and 90s. After the crack epidemic, we started breaking down as a family unit. We started having crazy morals. We lost our morals. We lost our values. We lost everything. And it shows today. We're suffering today still from the effects of the civil rights movement and the crack epidemic. And some people don't know what really went down, so they don't understand how it affects us. But I'm here to tell you, it does. So now gangs terrorize the black community. They terrorize the black community. If you live in a gang area, you know that you're being terrorized. You don't feel comfortable and you don't feel safe. And people think, oh, you black, you safe. You're not safe. You're terrorized. You're held hostage in your own community. If you're a kid growing up in a gang area, then you're part of the gang even if you're not. Because if you go somewhere else in another community and they say, oh, you part of this gang because you live in that neighborhood, then you're going to get dealt with just like you part of that gang, even though you're not. It's because you in that neighborhood where that gang is, so they're going to say you part of it. You don't get a choice. That's terrorizing them. That's holding them hostage. Who wants to be that? You got a kid that might want to make it out, that might want to do better, but he can't because he's being held hostage by this gang because he lived there, he or she. And then he gets affiliated because he has to, and then it goes downhill from there. Right? It's like gangs kill and destroy. They unalive and destroy. So they're like the devil. You know what the devil does, right? The devil comes to kill and destroy. That's what's happening. You know, we used to have good music in the 90s, right? In the 90s, 80s, and 90s, we had good fun. Hip-hop. Hip-hop was fun. It was like Will Smith fun. It was all fun. Fat Boys and all them, it was fun music. KRS-One, Knowledge, all that was stuff we had. Poor Righteous Teachers, KRS-One. I mean, the list goes on. I didn't write all the rappers' names down, but I can't remember. Helter Skelter, Tribe Called Quest, Common. We had Common's still out here today, but we had all of that going on back then. Brand Nubian. We had people like that out there back then. But then we was rocking the X hats. I made other videos about this a while ago. We had the X hats. You know, we was the African medallions. We had X Clan, groups like that. And then they neutralized all of that when they hit the scene with the gangster rap. We had Public Enemy. You know, we was doing this in middle school, man. We was kicking it like that in middle school, kicking knowledge to each other in middle school. We was like grown men in middle school back then because of the music that we had. Y'all look at Tupac, y'all talking about Tupac and this and that. Everybody was Tupac back then. It wasn't just him. Everybody was like that. All the youth. Everybody was talking like Tupac. Now, if you look at look at the youth today, they don't talk like that no more. They're not talking about building. They're not talking about knowledge. They're not doing that no more. You don't see that no more like you used to see it back then. Everybody was doing it. But then they hit you with the gangster rap. Then they changed the culture around. Now we talking like 5-year-olds. Everything is like, yeah, like this, like. We can't even carry on the conversation. The youth can't even talk. They turned the women into prostitutes and gold diggers. And the men became murderers and thieves as well as pimps. That's what they did. The women became prostitutes and gold diggers. They made women gold diggers. Now look what you got today. They started saying that back then. Now look at what they're saying right now. Look at the women today. Back then, women weren't like that. I'm not saying you have some, but women was not like they are today. They wasn't trying to show their stuff off, especially not black women. What you don't realize is that there was some things going on back then that the women, you knew it wasn't, black women just wasn't going to do it. I mean, she just wasn't going to do it. Some things that she wasn't going to do that. Black women like, nah, everybody knew. You better ask her to do that. She ain't doing it. Because that ain't what black women do. Black women respect themselves. They cut themselves a certain way. You wanted those things done, you should have went, you got to go holler at a white girl. Because a black woman don't do that. Now, black women do everything. And then some. Look at them. They worse than white women now. And look at the men. The men, they turn men into murderers, thieves, and pimps. That's what they turn them into. Look at the black exploitation movies. Everything in there about a pimp. And the music turned us into murderers because of the culture. And then that branched into trap music, right? What is a trap? Trap is a drug house. Then they created trap music. That comes from that same era. The gang culture, the violence, the drugs. That's where it comes from. Gang culture created a higher gun violence rate in the black community. Look, in 2021, 15,290 were unalived by guns. And that's the highest number on record. The highest on record. You hear me? 2021. 2021, 15,290 black people were unalived by gun violence. And that's the highest on record. Why are we leading the way in all the dumb stuff? Because all this stems from that time frame. It's a snowball effect that led us up into what we're dealing with right here today. Gun violence has been and will continue to rise among black Americans. And it all stems back to gang culture. That's what it all stems back to gang culture. In 2010, African Americans were 53% of victims of gun violence, even though we only 13% of the population. In 2010, African Americans were 53% of the victims of gun violence. Of gun homicide, even though we're only 13% of the population. Tell me what's wrong with that. We 53% of homicides, but we're only 13% of the population. In 2010. You don't think nothing wrong with this picture? You don't see what's going on? You don't see how this has affected the black community? But we celebrate this stuff as if it's nothing. We celebrate gun violence. We celebrate gangs. We celebrate people that went to prison. Look at all these YouTube channels. They're just all they talk about. And if they stopping people from going to prison, good. But it's nothing to be glorified. We suffering as a community. And we keep getting worse every year. We keep on getting worse. Because you can't tell nobody anything, because what you try to tell them is being countered by everybody glorifying the other stuff. You can't talk to them. You can't tell the youth nothing. You can't get them in their heads. Because everything you tell them, it don't matter, because look, why? Well, everybody else saying this. You lame for trying to tell them the right thing. You lame for trying to keep them out of prison. You lame. How do we celebrate the negativity all the time? We ain't never celebrate nothing good. I'm gonna start doing it. I start celebrating good stuff. I start putting it out there. I'm gonna start interviewing people. I'm gonna start finding the youth that's doing good, and I'm gonna put them on my channel because I'm tired of seeing prisoners, ex-convicts, getting a YouTube channel and getting popular, talking about what's going on in prison. I mean, it's cool, but then they start beefing, and then they create nonsense. Now they ain't showing no better than anybody else. They doing the same things. I'm just telling it like it is, man. I mean, this ain't no hate. It's just the truth. So, man, this is our game. Look at what we had today when it comes to violence. We love violence. Don't get me wrong. We love violence. It's too many things that has shown us violence. Where is the positivity? Where's the balance? Well, since it ain't none, I guess I'm going to have to be the one to create it. 2025, that's what I'm doing. I'm interviewing people that's doing good stuff. I'm going to find them. I'm going to seek them out. And I'm going to set up the interviews. And I'm going to talk to them. And I want them to share what they have. That's what I'm looking for in 2025. To interview people that's doing good. Black people that's doing good. That ain't involved in none of the nonsense. Or who may have come from the nonsense, but now they're doing something positive. That's what I'm doing for 2025. I thank you all for watching. Y'all have a happy new year and a good night.